Well, I was, yes. Mr. Bill Santown. No. Okay, now she's talking. We're running out of time. Sorry.
I don't have a loud voice like that.
He does.
Okay, so every year we do an annual Abraham Lincoln lecture. I wonder why. And now, just for all your notebooks and stuff, I had only read one Abraham Lincoln book in my life, and that was in graduate school, and it didn't make much of an impression on me. I thought he was a good guy. I never had anything against him. But then I came down here and learned that no one knew anything about Abraham Lincoln, so this became my mission. Okay, that was in Mormon. Okay, so our next speaker is the annual Abraham Lincoln lecturer, and he's a professor of political science, which is a bad thing because political science people tend to BS even more than English professors. So I'm warning him that he's on a time limit. I said that there was one or two people who have influenced me the most in trying to turn our Lincoln Center into an international center, and that's Dr. Carr, and Gary Kline is the second person, and his wife is from Taiwan, and both of them organized a conference. It wasn't on in Lincoln, but they allowed me in, and I knew about 2002, and by that time we had our first Lincoln conference in 1992 here, so I knew a little bit about Lincoln, and at that time Gary Kline played a role like Dr. Carr does in India in terms of trying to get the country interested in the global south or the third world, whatever you want to call it. And he now is the editor of the journal, Global South Studies Journal, which is there's examples of it out on the table. He was involved in that organization from the start, and got me even more involved than I wanted to at the time. And what else do I want to say about this? That's all I want to say. So, Dr. Kline.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Greetings to everyone. This has been really a fine conference so far. And in anticipation, I know my time is pretty limited, but I wanted to say something about Dr. Peterson. I did a quick search of his history, and he's a little bit like Lincoln because he's very accomplished, but you'd never know it because he's so humble. And I found out, one, he's a prolific scholar. He's got all kinds of publications. I ran out of fingers and toes, so I don't know exactly how many. He was a Harvard Fellow. He had a fellowship with the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's been a good friend to me over many years now. I tend to be a kind of a glass half full guy, and when I need to pick me up, I'll get in touch with Bill, and I'll say, things, I just don't think things could get any worse. And he always reassures me, of course they could. So I look to him for guidance and inspiration. I'd say I feel the same way about Bill that Trump feels about Kim Jong-un. I love it. I did not know all that much about Lincoln either when I was asked to deliver this lecture. And so a lot of what I found out, of course, I went to the historian-in-chief. And I found out that he was a Republican. You know, most people don't know that, according to Trump. And so that came as quite a surprise to me. I'm going to, in part, read, but mostly I'm going to have to abbreviate a lot of what I have to say here. I first take up an examination of Lincoln's traits of character, which of course are outstanding. We are kind of lucky, I would say. A lot of historians have noted that Lincoln was physically lazy. He didn't want to do labor very much, and that he followed his father in that regard. But unlike his father, he was mentally very active. And I would say that we're very lucky as a nation for the fact that he did go in this direction. Mental labor rather than physical labor. And I say if he had pursued excellence in rail splitting as opposed to the law and politics, things might have turned out very different during the Civil War. If we had had a different president during that period of existential crisis, a leader of inferior quality might certainly have presided over a radically different or even disastrous course of history. But fortunate for us, Lincoln was a political animal in the sense that Aristotle talked about. And early on, he took an interest in law and politics. His friend and partner, William Herndon, famously stated that Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. And I have a few of Lincoln's statements here along the way. I warned Bill that this lecture might get a little rogue since I recently retired. I'm feeling liberated, and it could be that some of this gets a little strange as the politics of the country is strange today. I have to keep a sense of humor to deal with it, to cope with it these days. So Henry Clay was the first person that Lincoln voted for president. A lot of people probably know that, and we had a very fun talk on Henry Clay. That may seem a little odd that Lincoln counted himself as a Whig, because that was the party of the elites at the time, and we think of Lincoln as a common man. He portrayed himself as a common man, and I would say he identified with the common people. But the Whigs, elites, adopted him. They saw something special in Lincoln, to their credit, and some of the Whig leaders early on gave Lincoln a helping hand, and his career in politics really did progress very quickly. So we have the Whigs to thank for that. He was not, as I say, an elitist by temperament. His wife, a patrician, I would say, always seemed to think of him as an awkward social being. But Whig leaders liked him and they helped him, and he always had a bond with the common people. As a corollary to his belief that the common man could make something of himself, the so-called self-made man concept, he held the position that the central idea of our founding was the equality of man. Sorry. the gendered language of the time, but equality was the central concept of the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln considered to be really the soul, the spirit of the Constitution. The Constitution was the letter of the law, the bones and flesh, but the Declaration of Independence was for Lincoln the heart, the beating heart of the document. Perhaps the single most referenced aspect of Lincoln's character was his reputation for honesty. At an early age, he acquired the nickname Honest Abe as he was working in New Salem, Illinois as a store clerk. He got a reputation for being scrupulously honest, and that nickname followed him through his career in law and politics. In a letter to Allen Ford, written August 11, 1846, Lincoln stated the following. He said, "I believe it is an established maxim in morals that he who makes an assertion without knowing whether it is true or false is guilty of falsehood, and the accidental truth of the assertion does not justify or excuse it." Now that's a very high bar to set for oneself. Don't say it if you don't know for sure that that's accurate. How many politicians today can you think of that set their bar that high? I take that as an answer. The silence. One time in the campaign literature that went out for his campaign, they made a mistake. They said, "Oh, Lincoln is a reader of Plutarch." Well, Lincoln immediately began reading Lives because he felt he had to make that statement right. So for Lincoln, honesty and personal integrity comprised the core around which a panoply of traditional Republican values, Republican in the philosophical sense, around which these Republican values were anchored: trustworthiness and loyalty, hard work and self-reliance, moderation, frugality, temperance, patriotism, devotion to family. Those were all aspects of the Republican tradition from centuries earlier, going back to Switzerland and early English traditions. Lincoln came up in a time when the idea of the self-made man had first appeared. That concept has been attributed to his role model, the first person he voted for president, Clay. Sorry. So Clay apparently coined that term. Self-made man. I like to throw in something Mark Twain said about it, because I think Twain had a better handle on this than Clay. Twain said the idea of a self-made man is as improbable as the idea of a self-laid egg. I always thought that was good. But like a skilled tailor fashioning a suit of clothes, Lincoln worked on himself to cultivate the qualities he deemed most worthy and noble. Then he wore those qualities with absolute humility. In the midst of the war, Lincoln stated, "If I were to try to read, much less answer, all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what is said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. Again, contrast that with what we see around us today in politics. Lincoln prepared himself for the law by developing habits of thought that would reinforce his other virtues. He read Blackstone's commentaries, which really emphasized orderly thought and logic. In a speech he made on January 27, 1838, to the Young Men's Lyceum in Illinois, Lincoln admonished the ambitious young men in attendance as follows. He said, "Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name," and he's referring here to George Washington, "to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over and desecrate his resting place." That emphasis on logical thought and reasoning, dispassionate reasoning, that again is something that we seem to be in short supply of these days. Jacques Barzun, the great intellectual, said of Lincoln that he certainly introduced into his correspondence and state papers more reasoning, more theoretical comments than any other president on record. And Hans Morgenthau proclaimed that qualities of his mind are as extraordinary as the qualities of his character. Lincoln, I neglected to say at the very start of my paper, of course, is in most lists, most rankings of presidents, he's number one most of the time. Very rarely you see him at number 2 or maybe number 3 in the list, but and it's qualities, I would say, of his character and his mind that made him such a powerful president and such a successful president, role model. And then as to his character, Lincoln had a forgiving character. Ostensibly, he held no grudges. He acted out of conviction, out of a sense of right and wrong, and he didn't allow himself the luxury of taking things out on other people. Clearly, he was not disposed to deal harshly with the South for the very costly act of rebellion. He was at odds with the radical Republicans in Congress right after the end of the war. They wanted to impose some rather harsher measures through the Wade-Davis bill, for example, which one of Lincoln's rare vetoes was of that Wade-Lincoln bill. And since I mentioned rare vetoes, it's an illustration of how, even though he's in a time of existential crisis for the country, and there is a need for very decisive decision-making by the president, he was restrained, very remarkably restrained in his exercise of executive powers. And he vetoed that bill because he felt that it was just too harsh. He had a 10% plan that he wanted to use instead, which was more forgiving and less harsh. He had clearly a strong sense of empathy, a compassionate disposition, a benevolent, generous spirit toward other people. This has been noted by by those who were his friends and those who knew him personally. Last night on CNN, I saw the presidential historian Michael Beschloss speaking, and in the context of the discussion, they were talking about how in a tweet Donald Trump had noted that starting a war might be a good way to sort of shore up your place in an election. This was one a while back, and he was using it in reference to Obama. But they're saying he knows that, and that could be a dangerous thing for him to know. And Beschloss was saying that Lincoln had asked that a national cemetery be placed next to his residence. And though it would be painful for him to see people being buried there, it would remind him all the time of the cost of war. Donald Trump hasn't seen fit to visit the troops in Afghanistan. No need. Then I take up a discussion of Lincoln's beliefs and principles, and these are fairly well known. And I have trouble discerning where Lincoln is in this picture. I didn't see anything explaining, unless maybe one of those top hats is him. But he's supposed to be in here, and a better expert might know which one he is. So Lincoln had a very strong attachment to the rule of law. He understood that the Constitution was at the top of our laws, but he couldn't really think of the Constitution without also thinking about the Declaration of Independence. And as I noted earlier, that really constituted the heart of the matter for him. It's been argued that for Lincoln, the Declaration had the force of, quote, a moral covenant. And he saw it as a bulwark against despotism. The Declaration, of course, is famous for its announcement of certain universal rights guaranteed under a rule of law. And so for Lincoln, the rule of law came to be akin to a civic religion. Again, from that speech to the young men at the Lyceum, Lincoln said, I hope I'm being over wary, but if I'm not, there is even now something of ill omen amongst us. I mean the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment. And that speaks again to me to our contemporary situation. But Lincoln had a contemporaneous faith. That is, he had a faith in the contemporaneous view of his time that human nature was such that representative government was possible because people could be educated and could think about political issues in a way that led them to make good decisions. So representative government, part of the Whig tradition. The Whigs emphasized legislative-led government. Representative government was something that Lincoln felt very strongly about, and he thought that popular will and decision-making could be implemented through representative institutions. And I feel obliged here also to note that, we'll get to this in a moment. I feel obliged to note that, like George Washington, Lincoln shared a really, I would say, remarkable orientation toward power, an appreciation for the virtues of self-restraint. Again, something that we're not seeing on a daily basis. Lincoln was ostensibly very humbled by the possession of power. He knew what suffering was going on around him, and it pained him. It really pained him. And I wish we had a Lincoln right now who could empathize and feel compassion for people who are going through hard times these days. I really wish that we could see more of that from our current leaders. So the suffering he witnessed around him deeply affected him. He was acutely aware that his decisions as president had real consequences for people. This orientation to the exercise of power flowed naturally and logically from his beliefs and his principles, which he had so carefully cultivated. In sum, Lincoln's patriotism was of a very profound sort. It was not the salute the flag, barbecue on 4th of July kind of patriotism. It was the kind of patriotism that comes out of very deep soul searching and reflection. And I would say that also is in rather short supply these days. So get into a discussion, which I'm really going to have to curtail here, but a discussion of how the world has changed since Lincoln's time. And of course that would be books worth of material if I really covered that. So I just scanned it in the first place, but a lot has changed since Lincoln's time. The question, remember, I started with was, can Lincoln still point the way? And where I'm going with this is a lot of the issues and challenges we deal with today are certainly beyond anything ever anticipated by Lincoln. Could not have imagined the kind of issues that we have to face today. So does Lincoln have ready answers for every tough question that we have? No. But I would say that the issues that we face definitely are issues that Lincoln could speak to in terms of the context of the situation. And I'll come back to this in just a minute. So Lincoln had projected this kind of view of himself as a self-made man, a commoner, who through hard work and especially developing himself, working hard to become better all the time, had become a success. And this was an ideal that was very popular during Lincoln's time and beyond. In the early days, the idea of an American dream was tied with this concept of the self-made man. And the idea of the American dream really was a collective notion at first. That is, it was the idea that America would become better over time, that collectively we would progress as a society and a country. And more it came to be focused on individuals. The idea of the American dream being something that I pursue and you pursue, and each of us in our own way tries to find happiness. And so it mutated somewhat. By 1931, James Truslow Adams, the great historian, defined the ideal as follows: life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each to succeed according to ability or achievement. No matter what class you're born into, no matter what the disposition of your birth. So the phrase came to have a meaning for individuals in American society, but American society, as I noted, has been changed, transformed dramatically since Lincoln's time. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, just a few years after Lincoln was lost to us. All kinds of scientific and industrial innovations came out of the Civil War. The Civil War was a catalyst for all kinds of changes in technology. Some of it very bad, of course, aimed at killing, but some of it better, aimed at transportation and communications and things that we rely on very heavily today. Wealth became more and more unevenly distributed over time. Again, quoting Mark Twain, gave rise to the Gilded Age, a term that Twain, Samuel Clemens coined. The U.S. Became a minor colonial power around the turn of the century. In 1898, through the Treaty of Paris, we took Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, for instance. Arizona was added to the country as the last of the 48 contiguous states in 1912. And that kind of unofficially marks the closing of the American West, the frontier, which is a monumental thing for the country. We had the war to end all wars, World War I, followed by the war that followed the war to end all wars, World War II, and a whole bunch of other wars after that, Korea. The first nuclear test took place, fittingly, in a desert in New Mexico called Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead. And that nuclear test was set off July 16, 1945, and that ushered in a dramatically new period for the world. We had a Cold War, we had a civil rights movement, we had Great Society programs, and you heard about a lot of this if you've been attending the panels. We had changes in the law, which I think some of them, and I'm going to cite the ones that I count in this regard, some of them were very unhealthy. One that is not well known, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886. Some of you may know this is the case in which it's first mentioned that corporations are treated like persons under the law. So the implication being that the protections of the Constitution extend to corporations as they do to individual human beings. Now, I taught constitutional law for years, and I always found this an outrageous distortion of the Constitution and of the intentions of the Founding Fathers, who, when they wrote the Constitution, corporations were mere legal entities which could be set up or abolished at any time by the state. And now they're eternal objects, they're entities, and protected by the Constitution. And through a line of reasoning now, culminating in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 2010. The court has announced that corporations can basically spend all they want to influence our elections, and we have the most unrestrained, freewheeling campaign finance laws in the world, I would guess. Way beyond what I think is healthy for the country. But Lincoln had lived in and believed in a simpler society where, yes, you might conceive of ordinary people working hard and getting ahead and becoming big successes, and that does happen, plenty still. But more and more and more people today, I think, feel that they're not getting anywhere despite any hard and honest work that they do. So Lincoln unquestionably had, I didn't see the movie. I don't know, did anybody here see this movie? Two people? I didn't see it, but this is where I start to go rogue, I'm afraid. Lincoln unquestionably had a critical and dire situation to manage, and he did so with, I would say, really great equanimity. The problems we face today are pretty daunting. I heard somebody, a Trump supporter on NPR just the other day say, everything in the country is going along pretty good, except for the possibility of a civil war. I don't know, think about that a moment. Except for the possibility of a civil war. So we do have some pretty stark contrasts in this country, some pretty vigorous debates and vitriol and anger and even violence. We have legacies of racism and sexism that we need to deal with. We have environmental and climate changes that we need to deal with. We have a host of very urgent problems to deal with, and some of them could become existential crises for us. Which means that we especially need the kind of leadership that I've been outlining here as the kind of leadership that Lincoln provided at a time of crisis earlier. We got lucky in 1860 to find Lincoln. At least I thought so when I voted for it. But I don't know that I don't know that we had that kind of luck going for us right now. In fact, I would say we don't have that kind. Lincoln was not a political philosopher, no. He didn't have answers to all our questions. How am I doing for time? I'm already over. He didn't have answers to all our questions, but let me cut to the chase. Remind you that Lincoln had a very strong attachment to the rule of law, which I don't find very prevalent these days, and not in the way that we hear Donald Trump talking about the rule of law. He uses the term politically, and he's not really talking about the rule of law. We don't have a Whig kind of government structure. We don't have a Congress that's leading. We don't even have a Congress that's functional, or a Congress that is overseeing properly the other parts of government. So I promised to try to tie this up for you a little bit. I alluded to Plato in here, and the fact that Plato, who, along with Alfred North Whitehead, I think really Plato was kind of the father of political philosophy for the West. Plato had made it his mission to find how we identify the best ruler. You know, the philosopher king was his answer. Wisdom tied with power. And I think that in Lincoln, of all our presidents, in Lincoln we found the person who was most like what Plato had in mind. Somebody who deeply thought about the issues and about the common good. Somebody who really sincerely reflected and managed to get sort of personal interest out of it. And we were very lucky in that regard. And it's up to us as a nation, to find the human materials necessary to get back to the kind of leadership that Lincoln provided. Lincoln was a statesman. He was a deep thinker. And we need more of those today as we're getting even supporters of Donald Trump, I guess, have to admit that he is less than truthful most of the time, or much of the time. Here's where I learned about Lincoln from Donald Trump. Oh, how'd this get in there? I told you, I'm way off the reservation now. So I guess that was the point I wanted to summarize, is that Lincoln provided the guidelines we need for the decision making on questions that menace us today, that challenge us today. Lincoln provided the kind of character and the basic foundation of principles that our leaders will need to make wise decisions in context of the questions we face today. If only people would learn more about Lincoln and emulate Lincoln more, I think that would be great. Thank you.